Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my retrospective boxing series. So, as long-time subscribers of mine will know, James Toney is a fighter who I've wanted to do a career review for a long time, and the reason for this is that he's actually, for me, one of the most interesting and enigmatic figures in boxing, and contrary to what you might believe if you read the title of this video, believe me, we'll get to that, he's actually one of my personal favourite fighters to watch. And I find him very, very interesting. The reason for this is that James Toney had a pretty unique fighting style. You know, he was a fighter who was quite lazy in his approach to boxing, never really being much of an athlete, but he had certain genetic gifts that allowed him to get away with certain things that most fighters generally weren't able to get away with. And he also had a knack for making certain fighters fight his kind of fight, forcing them to wear themselves out without putting in a lot of effort himself. I always found that fascinating, and whenever I watch any of his fights, from any stage of his career, I always feel as if I learn something from them, whether he wins or loses, or whether or not it's an entertaining fight. They're just very, very good educational fights to watch as far as I'm concerned. He's a bit of a boxing maverick in that regard, just a really interesting and enigmatic figure. However, up until recently, I had never really thought much about his place in boxing history, his resume, his accolades, or how good of a fighter he actually was. I just happened to find him interesting for my own personal reasons. However, for the purpose of this video, I decided to go out and watch a whole bunch of James Toney's fights, do a bunch of research into his career, look at as many fights as I could from various stages of his career, some of which in chronological order, and try to figure out and decipher how good a fighter he actually was, and how well he would have done in today's era, or any era besides his own. Thankfully, there's plenty of footage to watch. I mean, most of James Toney's fights are on YouTube, so you can go and watch any of them, and there's plenty of information to go on, so that's what I've been doing lately. And as you can tell by the title, this video isn't going to go the way I initially thought it would, because the more I watch James Toney, and the more research I do on him, the more I begin to realise that James Toney, contrary to popular belief, wasn't actually that good a fighter. In fact, I'll go one step further. Upon studying and analysing his fights, as well as his overall record and career, I would go as far as to say, and this will sound insane given the popular narrative on James Toney, but I would say that he wasn't even world class, and of course I'll go into detail about this. So before I actually go through Toney's resume and start dissecting his record as I normally do in these videos, I want to just reveal a few things about Toney that a lot of people might not know, that I recently discovered, as well as highlight a few of the popular mainstream narratives about Toney. So, if you ask any modern day boxing fan about James Toney, as well as any boxing journalist or historian, or anybody within the mainstream Western boxing fraternity, they'll all say that James Toney is an all-time great, that he had the greatest defense in boxing history, that he was one of the most skilled fighters of his era, that he had an incredible resume. They will highlight how he went from middleweight to heavyweight and won several titles, and they generally just tend to bloviate about the guy and how great he was, but conveniently, they seem to ignore a lot of the controversies surrounding Toney, which of course there were many, as well as the numerous losses he had at all stages of his career, and they seem to only ever highlight the positives and completely ignore the negatives. I would say outside of Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali, James Toney is without a doubt the most overrated and overhyped fighter in the history of boxing. On a side note, I'm not saying that Ali and Tyson weren't great, they certainly were, but the problem is, a lot of boxing fans, most boxing fans if truth be told, seem to think that those guys are demigods or something, and that they're just perfect fighters who couldn't possibly lose in their prime, and they were unstoppable and all that nonsense. The hype that those two get is just flat out ridiculous, but I digress. While Toney isn't as hyped up as those guys, he is definitely hyped up way beyond his ability. First of all, and I think this is very relevant when discussing a fighter's resume, James Toney had so many robberies on his record that I honestly couldn't believe it. In fact, he had more robberies in his career than any fighter I've ever seen. And I'm not just talking about close fights where he got the benefit of the doubt, he had plenty of those. I'm talking about fights where he literally got dominated, did practically nothing over the course of the fight, and walked away with a win or a draw. Officially, he has 10 losses and 3 draws. In my opinion, he should have had about 21 losses. I am not joking, and I'll go into detail about this. So to go through Toney's career, he turned pro in 1988 after a decent amateur career, and he spent the first few years of his career fighting journeymen over in America, and winning mostly by knockout. However, the first major warning sign of his career came in 1990, where he had a draw against a journeyman with a losing record called Sanderlin Williams. Now that fight took place in Toney's backyard, and his promoter was running the show. At this point in time, I haven't been able to find the full fight, but I have seen clips of it, so I won't call it a robbery, but I think it's logical to assume, given everything, that Toney lost that fight, particularly when you consider some of the other decisions he got that we're going to discuss in this video. To Toney's credit, they had a rematch and he won convincingly to put the result of the first fight behind him. However, in the first serious test of his career, he took on Murky Sosa. Like Toney, was an undefeated prospect at the time. So I watched that fight recently and I thought it was close and competitive. To be fair, Sosa was knocked down, and he also had a point deducted, so I can see why they gave it to Toney by a close split decision, but I personally gave it to Sosa. Won't call it a robbery, but I thought Toney got a gift. And let's be honest, if you're going life and death with a guy like Murky Sosa, and you're supposed to be an all-time great, that's not a good sign. So shortly after the Sosa fight, Toney got his first world title shot for the IBF title against Michael Nunn, who was undefeated in 36 fights at the time, so a major step up in class. Toney, to his credit, scored a spectacular knockout win in the 11th round, picking up his first world title. However, if you look at what happened in that fight prior to the knockout, Toney was getting absolutely schooled and dominated in that fight and was losing pretty much every round, getting his head jabbed in and everything, and he just couldn't match Nunn from a technical point of view. Don't get me wrong, it's great that he got the KO, and he showed a lot of heart and really good power. But we're talking about a so-called ATG here, and nobody's out here calling Michael Nunn an ATG, are they? And he was schooling Toney prior to the KO. I think that has to be taken into consideration. So Toney's first title defense at middleweight came against the fringe contender Reggie Johnson, and for me, this was the first of many egregious robberies of James Toney's career. Toney was dropped in round 2 and absolutely schooled by Johnson, who won the fight very, very clearly. However, in an absolutely shocking decision, James Toney was awarded a split decision victory, so a blatant robbery in that one. You could argue by that point in Toney's career he should have already had 3 losses on his record, and he was bailed out by the judges. A couple of fights later, he had the biggest test of his career yet, taking on Mike McCallum, who I did a career review for some time back, link in description. McCallum, who of course moved up in weight for the fight and had seen better days. Officially that fight was scored a draw, but me personally I thought Mike McCallum won the fight pretty clearly upon watching it again. So another robbery for Toney, and by that point for me he should have had 4 losses. His next fight was by far the worst robbery of his entire career, and for me one of the worst decisions I have ever seen. And that was his fight against Dave Tiberi. Dave Tiberi beat the absolute piss out of James Toney, gave him one of the most one-sided defeats of his career up until that point, and was absolutely robbed on the scorecards, with Toney once again walking away with a split decision. The decision was so bad that Dave Tiberi promised to retire from boxing if the result wasn't overturned, and true to his word, that's exactly what he did. He never boxed again. So the robbery against Toney ruined his career. So after the disgraceful robbery against Dave Tiberi, which in my opinion should have given Toney his 5th defeat, he had another fight against Mike McCallum, and I just got done watching that fight recently. It was not as close as I remember. In fact, I thought McCallum did even better, and won even more clearly than he did the first time, once again getting absolutely robbed on the scorecards, with Toney walking away with a majority decision win. It became clear at that point that the boxing establishment in America were protecting James Toney. Why? I have no idea, but clearly that's what's happening, because he was officially undefeated when he should have had about 6 losses by that point. So after the second robbery against McCallum, Toney decided to move up in weight to compete in the super middleweight division, and that basically sums up his title reign at middleweight, one of the most embarrassing title reigns I have ever seen. It's no wonder why, aside from the KO against Nunn, Toney fans never talk about his middleweight career. It's kinda just swept under the carpet and never brought up again, because most of his middleweight title defences were flat out robberies, and his reign was honestly a total embarrassment, and a bad look for boxing if truth be told. Toney's first super middleweight title shot came against the veteran IBF champion Iran Barkley, and this is a fight Toney fans like to brag about. I'm not sure why though, because Iran Barkley by that stage of his career was pretty shot. I mean, years before fighting Toney, he was knocked out in the first round by Nigel Benn. It took Toney 9 rounds to stop Barkley, so not that impressive when you think about it. His first defence of his super middleweight title came against Tony Thornton, who was a low-level fringe contender, who years earlier already lost to guys like Chris Eubank, Steve Collins, and several others. Toney won by a wide unanimous decision in a pretty lacklustre fight. But at least that one was a genuine win, and it was one-sided, so it is what it is. We'll give him that one. He had a couple of defences against low-level opposition, one of which he won by a 12th round KO in a fight that was very close on the cards against a guy called Charles Williams, who the previous year was absolutely schooled and dominated by Henry Masker at light heavyweight. He moved down to fight Toney, and gave him a very tough fight before being stopped in the 12th. And as for Toney's third and final defence at super middleweight, he took on Roy Jones Jr., and got absolutely embarrassed. Roy won every second, every moment of that fight, dropping Toney in the third, and giving him a boxing lesson, winning by a wide unanimous decision, giving Toney the first official defeat of his career. In my opinion, it should have been his 7th, but whatever. Finally, boxing politics couldn't bail him out. That's Toney's entire reign at both middleweight and super middleweight. At middleweight, most of his defences were flat out robberies, or he came from behind to win, and at super middleweight he had 2 successful defences against low-level contenders, and an embarrassingly one-sided loss to Roy Jones. Not very impressive if you ask me. So he moved up to light heavyweight after the Jones fight and took on Montel Griffin. Griffin was an undefeated prospect at the time with only 14 pro fights, and he completely schooled and dominated James Toney, winning easily by majority decision. Should have been unanimous, and giving Toney the second official defeat of his career, which for me should have been his 8th loss. So as far as Toney being an ATG, it's not looking good so far, is it? After losing to Griffin, Toney dropped down a level and started fighting Journeyman. He actually got a shot at the vacant WBU title against a guy called Freddy Delgado, knocking him out in the 5th. It's worth pointing out that Delgado was KO'd in the first round by Michael Moorer, and destroyed in 2 rounds by Charles Williams. He also got completely schooled by a past his prime Tommy Hearns, fighting way above his best weight division. So while it wasn't a bad win, it was nothing to brag about. The following year, after a bunch of easy wins against Journeyman, Toney got a rematch against Montel Griffin, and was completely schooled again, losing by a one-sided unanimous decision, proving the first fight wasn't a fluke. The following year he had a 3rd fight with Mike McCallum, who at that point in his career was in his 40s and completely shot. It was a close and competitive fight, but in my opinion Toney was a fair and genuine winner, winning by a close unanimous decision. So he finally had a genuine win over McCallum, when McCallum was completely shot on his 3rd attempt. Whoop-de-doo. Toney then got a shot at the IBO title in his very next fight, and lost again by majority decision to a guy named Drake Thadze, a journeyman with 8 losses, who was completely schooled and dominated by Virgil Hill and knocked out by Dariusz Michalczewski. That guy beat James Toney, go figure. So that sums up Toney's light heavyweight career. He did practically nothing worth talking about except win the WBU title against a journeyman, losing to every half-decent opponent he fought, including losing to a journeyman for the IBO title. So yeah, it's not looking good. It seemed like Toney had some sort of personal relationship with the IBO, however, since for his very next fight he moved up to Cruiserweight and fought for the vacant IBO title against a journeyman with 14 losses called Steve Little. How Steve Little was able to get ranked to fight for that title, I have no idea. Toney won by a wide unanimous decision. So Toney won the IBO title and never defended it, instead dropping down a level, and for the next few years fighting nothing but low-level journeymen, before getting a shot at the IBF title in 2003 against the undefeated Vasily Girov. Now, this is one of the fights that Toney fans like to brag about, as if Girov was some kind of elite fighter or something like that. In reality, Girov was a paper champion with a padded record, who never beat anybody of note, or did anything worth mentioning his entire career. In fact, I'll go one step further. Girov, in my opinion, was one of the weakest title holders in the history of the Cruiserweight division. So, Toney attempted to basically cherry-pick the weakest title holder at Cruiserweight, and in my opinion, he lost. Girov completely outworked, outboxed, and outlanded Toney, winning most of the rounds clearly, and doing more than enough to win the fight. He got dropped in the 12th round from sheer exhaustion, since Girov had no defense whatsoever, and couldn't pace himself in fights, and he basically just stood in front of Toney the last round, leaving himself wide open. But in my opinion, he won the fight clearly, and was absolutely robbed on the scorecards, with Toney winning by a unanimous decision, and the commentators in HBO doing everything they could to justify the decision, completely ignoring the fact that Toney spent most of the fight on the ropes getting hit. You know, every time he did anything, they were exaggerating. It was, you know the deal, it was one of them situations. Brainwashing the audience to justify the robbery. And that's it for Toney's entire Cruiserweight reign. Never defended his title once, and lost the vast majority of his most significant fights of his career up until that point. I'm not seeing an all-time great fighter so far. So after beating Girov by a controversial decision, Toney conveniently decided to avoid the entire Cruiserweight division and move up to heavyweight, and the first fight he had there was against Evander Holyfield. It's worth pointing out that Holyfield going into that fight had lost 3 of his last 6 fights and had a draw and a myriad of health issues. So you have to take into consideration that it wasn't a particularly well prepared version of Holyfield. And to be fair to Toney, he won the fight in devastating fashion, dominating Holyfield and stopping him in the 9th round. I'd say that it was probably the best performance of his career, and easily his best win. I'll give Toney credit for that one. Stopping Holyfield despite the size advantage was very impressive, so that's a great win right there in spite of everything. Weirdly enough, the best performances of Toney's career from a technical and strategic point of view came during his early heavyweight career. He had a fight with the undefeated Rydell Booker, and completely schooled him, winning on points, and then got a shot at the WBA title against John Ruiz. And in another pretty good performance, Toney outboxed Ruiz in a pretty close and competitive fight, winning by unanimous decision. Close fight, but a genuine win. Unfortunately, Toney failed a drug test after the fight, and the result was overturned and listed as a no contest, and Toney was stripped of the title. So he was WBA heavyweight champion very briefly, but the drug test cost him the title. And for all you PED Puritans out there, I know most American boxing fans are like this. You know, these guys who are all about having a clean sport, and you've got a problem with steroids in boxing. I don't recall a lot of these people ever bringing up the fact that James Toney was on steroids. You know, you think that would be something that these people would talk about, and it would be a black mark against his career, but I guess it depends on the fighter, doesn't it? It depends who it is, but I digress. After an easy win against Dominic Gwynn for the IBA title, he got a shot at the WBC title against Hazeem Rahman, and it was another absolutely disgusting robbery. Hazeem Rahman absolutely dominated Toney, winning easily 10 rounds. I personally had that fight 10 rounds to 2 for Rahman, and in a shocking decision, the judges had the fight a draw. So another shocking robbery right there, one of the worst of Toney's career. He practically did nothing in that fight, and somehow walked away with a draw. Then he had 2 fights with Samuel Peter, and lost clearly both times. The first fight he had some success, but nowhere near enough to win the fight. And the second fight he got completely dominated and schooled, and in my opinion he lost pretty much every round. He then had a rematch with Hazeem Rahman, and it was another disgusting robbery. Rahman came out and dominated the first 3 rounds with ease. Then at the end of the 3rd round, Toney blatantly, intentionally headbutted Rahman, and the referee stopped the fight, announcing Toney as the winner. Thankfully this was overturned, and listed as a no contest, so another flat out robbery. He then got a fight against Fraser Kendo, and it has to be said that Toney looked completely shot at that point, badly out of shape, and in all his fights from that point on he barely ever threw a punch. In the Oquendo fight he got absolutely schooled and dominated, losing pretty much every round, just getting pummeled the entire fight. And in another shocking robbery, Toney was awarded a split decision victory. It was just absolutely shocking, and it was getting so ridiculous at that point. Even the commentators for that fight had to point out how Toney was getting constantly bailed out by judges, and it was just getting over the top at that point. A couple of years later in 2011, Toney moved back down in weight to cruiserweight, and somehow got a shot at the WBA interim title against Denis Lebedev over in Russia. Don't ask me how, I have no idea. Travelling out of the States for the first time in his entire career. And he was absolutely embarrassed, losing every single second of every single round, losing by a wide unanimous decision. Toney did nothing the entire fight, and barely even threw a punch, completely shot to pieces, didn't even try. The rest of Toney's career from that point on was basically a freak show, and barely even worth talking about if truth be told. He got dominated by Lucas Brown, lost to journeymen like Charles Ellis. He even took part in the prizefighter tournament in the UK, knocking out Matt Legg in the 3rd round, which is hilarious. Shows you how absolutely crap that guy was. And losing on points to Jason Gavin. So a bunch of low-level bum fights that were relatively inconsequential, and don't add or remove anything from his legacy, really. So yeah, that's James Toney. And I'm going to say something that will sound controversial here, but I honestly don't think you can really argue with this, because the fights are there, all you have to do is watch them. If James Toney's entire career was properly officiated, this guy would be a journeyman. This guy would never have been world champion, because had he lost that fight to Murky Sosa, he probably wouldn't have got the title shot against Nunn. And had he lost the fight officially to Reggie Johnson, and he got completely schooled in that fight, I don't care what anybody says, that fight wasn't even close, he would probably have never fought at world level again, because, I mean, nobody's going to come out here and tell me that Reggie Johnson was a world-class fighter, are they? So, I mean, what annoys me about James Toney, and this really annoys me in retrospect, is how you go to any video talking about James Toney, any documentary, any fight, any podcast, anything, all you hear is people bloviating about this guy, talking about how great he was. People just say that he's an ATG, and he's one of the most skilled fighters ever. How is one of the most skilled fighters ever, and an all-time great, getting schooled by people like Dave Tiberi, Montel Griffin, Reggie Johnson? Are those guys all-time greats? I'm trying to find, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted as I record this, I'm trying to find one world-class opponent, aside from Michael Nunn, who was beating Toney before he got, let's call it what it is, he got caught with a lucky punch. I'm trying to find one genuine world-class opponent that Toney actually beat. Because from what I can tell, from actually sitting down and watching his fights, I'm not just looking at BoxRec here, I'm actually hunting down James Toney fights and watching them start to finish. I can't find a genuine victory that this guy had at world level his entire career. Genuinely one of the most overrated hype jobs in the history of boxing. I'm not even joking. Now, I had a lot of fun watching Toney's career because, like I said, he was able to do certain things in the ring that I think are good for educational purposes. You know, he's very good at that lazy fighting style. And one thing that does kind of impress me when I think about it, and I've talked about this on stream before, is how James Toney was never stopped at any stage of his career, despite being a natural middleweight who competed at heavyweight for years. Now, that does still impress me to an extent, but the more I think about it, the less it really impresses me, because the main reason, in my opinion, why he never got stopped is because he was the kind of fighter where if he realised in the early rounds of a fight that he couldn't beat you, he would literally just stop trying and he would just survive and spoil, slip and slide and try and ride with punches and let you gas yourself out and essentially just basically leave it in the hands of the judges, because he got used to being bailed out by the judges. If you look at some of Tony's fights at middleweight, like against Reggie Johnson, where he got dropped and outboxed and pretty much lost every round going into the second half, he tried to impose his size on Reggie Johnson and he tried to win that fight legitimately, but he just couldn't do it because he wasn't skilled enough. But because he got bailed out by the judges, he got used to being bailed out by the judges. So when he was losing a fight, he wouldn't even try, and he was just content on going the distance. And I think that's what he did in a lot of his heavyweight fights. You know, again, if you look at the Fraser Kendo fight, Fraser Kendo absolutely battered him and pummeled him with the jab all night. And Toney just lay on the ropes, slipping and sliding, not really offering any resistance, not really asserting himself at all. He was kind of like Kevin Johnson. That was what he used to do. You know, he would try in the first couple of rounds, and if he couldn't win, he would just survive and spoil. So that's, in my opinion, why Toney never got stopped. It wasn't really because he was that tough. It wasn't because he was that great. You know, he just wouldn't try. He was a spoiler in the ring. He knew how to survive and spoil. So, how would Toney do in today's era, at any division he competed in? And how would he do in any era besides his own? Well, you have to look at where I think Toney was in his physical prime, and I would say that was the super middleweight to light heavyweight division, even though he did practically nothing in those divisions. So, let's just say, think of some middleweight to light heavyweight fighters that he could have fought, or who were in and around about his era, or the era that preceded it. So, I think Bernard Hopkins would have beaten him easily. I think he would have just out-hustled him and outboxed him. We already know what Roy Jones did. Some people say that Toney would have won the rematch. No chance. I think Roy would have beaten any version of Toney. I think Joe Calzaghe would have absolutely embarrassed him. I don't think that fight would have even been remotely competitive. I don't think Toney would have won a second of that fight. I think Antonio Tarver would have absolutely battered him. I think Dariusz Mikuchevski would have absolutely battered him. I think Sven Otke would have completely schooled him. I think Steve Collins would have beaten him. I would give Robin Reed a decent chance against him. I think Mikkel Kessler would beat him. Against guys like Nigel Benn or Chris Eubank, I make that 50-50. I think maybe I'd favour Toney slightly just based on styles. I think Graziano Roggiani would have had a good chance of beating him just based on his, boxing fundamentals and his high guard and his pressure. He would have put Toney into his shell and he would have just spoiled his way through it. I would even give Mario Vite a decent chance of beating Toney. I'm not joking. I mean, a guy that's 6'3" and can move laterally for 12 rounds and pummel him with a jab, pepper him from the outside. I don't see why Mario Vite couldn't beat him. I mean, he beat Charles Brewer, who in my opinion was on a similar sort of level to Toney, skill-wise. So, yeah, I honestly think there's a lot of middleweights, super middleweights and light heavyweights who could have beaten Toney. I'd probably favour him over someone like Talani Malinga or Richie Woodall. I think he was a little bit better than those guys, but not by much. I think Henry Masker would have completely schooled him. Talking about the cruiserweight division, I think any world-class cruiserweight from the past 20 years would beat James Toney, if truth be told. I think Lebedev would have beaten any version of Toney. I know Toney was completely shot when they fought, but even still, Toney didn't win a moment of that fight, and I think in his prime, he might have won a couple of rounds, but I still think he would have lost. I think Marco Huck would have put a beating on him. I think Usyk would have absolutely embarrassed him, probably knocked him out. Gassiev, Briedis, Cruiserweight, any of them would beat James Toney, in my opinion. Jirov was honestly, just go and look at Jirov's record and some of his fights. He was genuinely one of the weakest fighters to ever win a cruiserweight title. So yeah, don't rate him at all. As far as the heavyweight division is concerned, I mean, you're noticing a pattern with Toney, aren't you? He basically cherry-picked the easiest title holder in each division that he fought in, and never really defended his title against credible opposition, because when he tried to do that at middleweight and super middleweight, he got embarrassed, so he never really did that above then. But at heavyweight, he went for John Ruiz, who was easily the weakest title holder there, who had had 3 wars with Holyfield that took a lot out of him, was already beaten by Roy Jones, and in his very next fight after Toney was absolutely schooled by Nikolai Valuev, who is considered one of the weaker heavyweight champions. So I think any top-level heavyweight would have destroyed James Toney. You know, I think the Klitschko's would have knocked him out cold. He's very lucky those fights didn't happen. I think Povetkin would beat him. I think David Haye would beat him. I think any genuine world-class heavyweight that wasn't, you know, one of the weaker title holders like John Ruiz would have beaten James Toney. So yeah, is James Toney an all-time great? Not even close. Is he world-class? I think that's debatable. I honestly do. I mean, he did have a couple of very good wins. Like I said, the Michael Nunn knockout was impressive. I know he got schooled prior to the knockout, but the knockout was very impressive. And he had that very, very good victory over Holyfield, who, again, had lost 3 of his last 6 fights, with one of them being a draw. You know, how good was he at that point of his career? I don't really know. I mean, how old was he? Like 41, something like that. Not looking good for James Toney. He's nowhere near as good as I thought he was. This is going to sound harsh, but I really don't think it is, given everything I've said in this video. And again, you can go and watch the fights yourself if you don't believe me. James Toney is one of the biggest hype jobs in the history of boxing. Real talk. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. God bless.